Okay, welcome everyone to this event on behalf of the Horizons Institute, where we are having a discussion panel with some esteemed guests talking at what comes after the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we have an audience here in the room, also we have people joining us online, as well as it being recorded so people can enjoy it at their leisure later on. My name is Professor Julia Bennon. I'm the Dean of the Business School, and it's my honour to facilitate this session. But these are the experts who are going to bring, I'm sure, some really interesting and vibrant discussion to the event. So welcome everyone, and what I will do is I will ask each of our panel to introduce themselves and then just speak for a couple of minutes about their views on the topic, and then I will open up with a set of questions that we've got pre-prepared. We also had some questions submitted from the audience, way more than we can ever ask, so we will work through them, but please feel free, if you're in the room, to put your hands up, and I'll prioritise the people who are here as well in terms of asking your questions. So if we could start with Ian Smith, who is the head of the Secretariat of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board and Senior Advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian. Thanks to everybody and to my colleagues as well. It's great to meet you and to get to hear some really important ideas and discussion on, you know, what happens after 2030. What do we do? What do we do next? As you've heard, my current role, I'm with the World Health Organization, my current role is the head of the Secretariat to the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and that's a body, an independent body of experts set up about 5 years ago to assess the state of the world's preparedness for pandemics and other health emergencies. And its main claim to fame was that in 2019, in September of that year, just a few weeks before COVID broke out, it declared that the world was facing the prospect of a major pandemic, which would have enormous health and economic consequences, and the world was simply not prepared. And it issued that report, as I say, in September, and lo and behold, a few weeks later, COVID starts. And it argued that despite all of the previous pandemics and health events, there seems to be this cycle of panic and then neglect when it comes to addressing them. And that's a cycle that's probably plays out, not just in pandemics, but almost in every other area of human security. And for me, that's really what we should therefore be looking at in terms of what after the SDGs is how do we address those cycles of panic and neglect which lead to the catastrophes that we've seen, the existential crises that we face in terms of environmental crises, in terms of nuclear threats, in terms of pandemics. How do we address those? And for me, that really is critical because there are some shared features of human security and human development and of these existential threats that I think are common to all and therefore important that we look at them. So, for example, they are all largely due to human behaviour, both in terms of their cause, but therefore also in terms of their prevention and reduction. Secondly, they require collective action. Individual action alone, by any nation, by any stakeholder, individual action is not going to be sufficient. No one is safe until all are safe, as is often said. So those two aspects of collective action and shared responsibility are going to be crucial in anything we do in the future. And yet we face huge barriers in ensuring that there is effective collective action, particularly in a world today which is so polarised geopolitically and faces such extraordinary threats and also economic crises that almost hinder the work that's desperately needed. So I could go on for a long time, but I should stop there, shouldn't I?
Thank you very much. Fantastic. And joining us online we have Lisa Russell, who is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker and founder of Create 2030. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much. So you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So greetings and good morning from Brooklyn. I wish I could be there with you all, but really honored to be able to have a voice here. I do work as a creative practitioner, so I'm an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. I've also done well as a screenwriter, but I've carved out a really interesting space in the UN NGO sector as a contracted filmmaker and arts curator. So I've been working at sort of the intersection of arts, social justice, and global development, sustainable development since the Millennium Development Goals and through, to today. In 2015, I launched an artist network called Create 2030, which was really about engaging creative professionals, professional artists, and storytellers, primarily BIPOC and from Global South, to commit to using our voices and our platforms in support of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I wear a lot of different hats, as a lot of kind of gig workers, creative workers do. I teach workshops, I do a lot of speaking, I get paid to curate and produce films for the UN. And so my, I think, contribution to this panel is really going to be looking at the issue of culture and arts around the next set of development goals. I was fortunate enough to be part of the town hall meetings at the UN in the writing of the current SDG outcome document. And I can say that there was a push for inclusion of arts and culture into the formal outcome document, but because we lack representation as creatives in this space, we didn't get that language. I literally did a word count. There are 16,000 words in the SDG outcome document. Arts and artists are never mentioned, and creativity is only mentioned twice. And so I have a lot to say about the topic of what comes after the current, SDGs, and how can we promote more inclusivity of the creative economy in developing the next set of goals. So thank you for having me.
Great, thank you very much. Next we have Molly Scott-Cato, who is a Professor of Green Economics at Roehampton University. Molly.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here. So I've got quite a few different things I've done in my life. I've been a Green politician. I was an MEP between 2014 and 2020 when Brexit happened. And as you said, I'm also an academic, and I've written a lot about green economics, and that essentially means designing the economy so it's just and fits comfortably within planetary limits. And I would say this is the most urgent task for humanity right now. I've also been a more active green campaigner, and given that what's happening to protest at the moment, with this government sort of making it almost illegal to protest, I should say I've also been a protester, and I helped launch the Extinction Rebellion, and I've been arrested, although not for that reason, for opposing nuclear weapons. So I've been active on lots of different fronts, but mainly I'm trying to save humanity from itself in terms of the absurd economic model which grows out of control, rewards a tiny number of people extremely well, and leaves a lot of people in poverty. You'd be surprised there weren't more economists doing that, but actually I'm pretty lonely. So the main thing I would suggest we need to do in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals is take into account the planetary limit when we're designing them. This is actually quite a contentious issue, because as soon as you say, there's a limited amount of, I would say biosphere, but let's say, stuff, natural resources from which we can draw economic product and indeed human well-being, then immediately you get confronted with the question of how are we going to share that? And at the moment it's shared desperately unfairly. So that's true within our own country, where we see growing levels of inequality. It's also true across the world. And the lifestyle we enjoy here results from massive use of energy and resources, and that's simply unsustainable. But it has generated for us extraordinary systems and knowledge and understanding and technology. And so one of the things that I think is really important in terms of, as I would see it, global justice, which is what's encapsulated in the Sustainable Development Goals, is that we share the knowledge that we've acquired during that time, which is about technology transfer without charge to countries across the world. And also that we involve ourselves in what's called climate reparation. So we actually fund the damage that we've done across the world by our use of fossil fuels in the past and now. That's a key point for me. And I would say the other one is that the responsibility for climate change is very unequally shared. The 10% most polluting people in society are responsible for about half the greenhouse gas emissions, according to the UN Development Programme. So climate justice is what everybody's out on the street demanding, but my work is about trying to think through how you could redesign a global economy so you actually had climate justice.
Thank you very much. And next, Benjamin Lamty, who's a visiting professor of meteorology at the University of Leeds.
Thank you. Actually, my background is purely physical science. I started as a weather forecaster after being trained. I started as a physicist. My bachelor's degree is in physics. Then I moved to weather forecasting after being trained at the Methodist College. And I worked as a weather forecaster in the Ghana Meteorological Agency, moved to university as a lecturer, and then moved to African Center for Meteorological Applications for Development. So operational community, research community, and development sector. By way of training, like I said, my background is physics, then I have a certificate in weather forecasting, postgraduate diploma in computing information systems, a master's in meteorology, another master's in applied and agricultural meteorology, a PhD in geosciences with a minor in high performance computing. So purely physical science. But I am always concerned about how we take the science and make it relevant to the people on the ground. And that's the angle I'm coming from. And when I look at the SDGs, I see it as project focus. But real development doesn't only focus on project. Real development starts after the project. I have three communities in mind: the research community, the operational community, and the user community. Now, what we do during projects is to demonstrate the benefits. Immediately, the projects end and the funding ceases, nothing happens. And that is when development starts. So that's my concern. How do we mainstream all these targets we are talking about into operational activity? When you write proposals, you are supposed to demonstrate which of the SDGs is relevant. That's easy. There are 16, right? 17, actually. So you can easily pick any of them and show that I am going to demonstrate this, I'm going to demonstrate it, I'm going to demonstrate that. When the funding finishes, what happens? The real people doing the work are the operational people, and they are supposed to improve their work by the research that we are doing. So I'm a bit passionate about that, and that's at the angle I'm coming from. I started from operations before moving into research. And anytime I think about research, I think about how would this be practicalized? How would this be mainstreamed? I'm from a meteorology background. I can tell you, if you check the publications right now, there are so many publications on the onset of rainfall, particularly in the tropics. So many publications. But the operational community is still struggling to get the prediction of the onset of rainfall correctly. So what is missing here? We can talk about that later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And finally, Carl Miller. He's the Research Director of the Centre of Analysis and Social Media at Demos.
All right, well, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So who am I? I've been a think tanker, a kind of writer, a journalist, but really, to introduce myself to you all, I've spent my career up to this point being an investigator of the kind of mysteries created by the digital age in one kind or another. So that might be assassination markets on the dark net, or it might be other kinds of cybercrime, or it might be hate speech flowing across social media platforms, how the tech giants really work. That's always been the kind of what I've been interested in, really, how all these technologies kind of reach through the screens we all use and change who we are and how we organise and the problems we see in the world and the reasons we get up in the morning and how we fall in love and out of love and all those things in between. And I guess, like, to foreground the one big idea to begin, I think this is a bigger issue than just the SDGs or any multilateral process, but it's one that over the last 5 or 6 years anyway, I've become increasingly convinced is so unbelievably central and important to understand the world we're living in and how we can begin to govern it better, is this idea of permissionless innovation. You're probably aware, of course, that the world is being shaped by these technologies that come apparently out of nowhere. Who'd heard about GPT kind of a year and a half ago? Is anyone worried about GPT now? We should be. I was in a government call last week where they said that it was a researcher that said that we're likely to see one of the largest contractions in the workforce since the Black Death. in the next 5 years. Like, this is how profound some of the technologies which are emerging are. But the problem is that the way this is all set up is that the people that develop these technologies kind of actually don't care about any kind of discursive forum, really. They don't care about kind of ethics discussions. They don't care really almost about politics, because technological development isn't really controlled or shaped by that. Technology development purely happens on the basis of the capacity of people to build the technology that they want. And that means if you go to the Valley, like the kind of forces that really drive the technologies which emerge are forces of profit and forces of capitalism. And that kind of really shapes the technologies that we see then emerge, like both the ones that do and the ones that don't. So if we, like, again, a broader thought, but we have to, in the years ahead, begin to fuse the kind of technologies that emerge and the kind of technologies that shape us with the kind of ethics and the frameworks and the humanizing and the civilizing principles which we use to try and at least shape so many other parts of life. But at the moment, they're really not connected up at all. And whilst they're not, like, what will continue to happen is whatever is decided by the new SDGs, whatever is decided by the UN, whatever comes out of discussions like this in universities all over the world will feel entirely disconnected to technologies that will just emerge, and revolution after revolution will hit us, and it will continue to feel like it's something that happens to us rather than something that we're part of and have a hand in.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with a few questions, but I'm sure that this has already motivated some questions from you, so have them at the ready. Maybe if we could just pick up the culture piece, as Lisa said, culture has been missing from the Sustainable Development Goals. So how should it be put in? Should it be embedded across all of the goals, the arts and culture piece, or should it have its own goal? What would you be pushing for?
Thank you. So I may have kind of an unpopular opinion about this, but it comes from 20 years experience kind of as a practitioner and working very closely in the UN NGO space. I do not believe the way things are going that we are ready for an arts and culture pillar. And that is because I feel that artists are still very much tokenized in this space. It's sort of like, oh, we need a singer or dancer to open up this conference and this or whatever. But there's not a lot of artist-led spaces that attract artists in the spaces and the ways that creative professionals are interested in. As it stands, I fear that if there is an arts and culture pillar, it's going to be driven by policy and program makers, which is not bad. They are important in this conversation, but it's very tilted. There's not enough representation. I've learned a lot by working in the youth space at the UN, and they've done incredible work to ensure that youth have representation at the United Nations. They have a UN-wide, Youth 2030 agenda. They have a Youth Envoys office. They have programs that are led by and created by young people. We need the same for creatives, because we definitely, I joke that I'm multilingual. I speak artist language and I speak UN language. They're very different. Our cultures are very different. Our survival and means of our livelihoods are very, very different. So I would love to see arts and culture integrated into the next development goals, but I feel like it needs to be integrated with representation from artists in the UN NGO space so that we can articulate what that looks like for us. During COVID, it was, excuse my language, I'm not going to say it, but it was horrible, because at the same time that we were celebrating 2021 as the International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development, huge historic year for us, there were endless numbers of arts contests asking artists to work for free at the same time that we're recognizing that the creative industries were hit really hard by the pandemic. They were claiming that we were the first to get hit and will probably be the last to recover. And this only flies by because there is no system to check these policies and these campaigns. I personally would love to see a UN-wide Arch 2030 agenda written by and with creative practitioners, not celebrities, not influencers, but people who represent the informal arts sector, in order to articulate what development means for us and what our role is in it. I can argue all day the power of arts and storytelling. There's even research that shows how powerful storytelling can be in mobilizing an audience. But we are only, I feel, primarily looked at as sort of, again, tokenized performers, not really engaged in conversations, not engaged in the spaces in the way that artists and creatives do. Right now, I'm curating the Women Deliver Arts and Film Festival, and I asked some of the finalists to join this conversation. So if they're in the chat, be like, let's shout out what you're doing. But we need more artist-led spaces around development in general in order for us to articulate, again, what these goals mean for us and how we can be, a force to help, realize them. Artists that I know are doing incredible work at the community level. There are poets, beatboxers, DJs, really engaging at the local community. And if we can mobilize the local community to care about the SDGs, maybe we can have this sort of global consensus to complement the work of policy program, donors, academic, government, etc. But right now, I do not think we are ready for a culture pillar.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. Ben?
I want to look at culture from another perspective. In culture and development. In terms of development, we have the pillars: economy, society, and environment. And I think we just need to rethink the society pillar, because culture is what defines the people. Culture is what we are, who we are. And society is just an aggregate of people. So if society is an aggregate of people in an ordered manner, in a community, that means implementing projects, implementing initiatives in a society, you need to know the culture of the people. And so to make it relevant, to make it effective, to make it acceptable to the people, you need to know their culture and implement it in a way that they will buy in. So for me, culture is embedded in the society pillar. We just need to rethink how we go about it. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where user engagement comes in when we are implementing projects. Mm-hmm. The old paradigm is for researchers to just come up with our own research questions and think we know what the community needs, we know what the community needs, we know what is required, and we are just in control. So we just come up with our own research questions, do the research, and provide the answers. Mm-hmm. Are they relevant? We need to engage the users, the community down there, find out what they need, co-produce the solution with them. And in that way, you already have ownership for what you are developing, and they are part of the design. So it becomes relevant for them, and then we can see things work. So for me, culture is embedded in the society pillar. We need to rethink the way we address society pillar. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Molly, you wanted to follow up?
I just wanted to quickly say that obviously culture is the only thing that makes life worth living. If you think about all the key moments of your life, you fall in love, you write poetry to the person you love, or was that just me? Can't remember too long ago. When you get married, you have music and poetry there. Somebody dies, you have readings, it's just like it's what makes us human. I so much agree with what Ben was saying. But also it's very important right now because we're facing unprecedented crises, and we need to be able to think in a creative way to address those crises. And I think I would extend from what you're saying and say that actually the economy pillar is blocking the society pillar, particularly in this area, because under a capitalist system designed the way ours is, anything that is achieved through creativity and can make a profit, can make money, is immediately enclosed by the economy. And anything that doesn't make money is marginalized or tokenized, as Lisa was saying, and that's one of the fundamental problems with the way our economy is organized, because if it pays you to be creative, you become part of a system where actually your creativity is bought and owned by somebody else and you're alienated. I'm not a Marxist, but that concept is really useful. But if you're not able to make money, then you're always fitting it in the side of a completely boring and probably pointless life, maybe in a factory or a call center, So that's a problem with the economic system, that it values the wrong things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. Really interesting this. I was wondering if, following up on your comments about culture and society, straight to it, the issue of trust. And it's trust that has been the trust deficit was one of the main factors that was most predictive of outcomes in relationship to COVID in many countries. Trust in authority, trust in science, etc. And some of the stuff that you were talking about, Carl, there, in terms of the dark web and everything associated with it, the whole breakdown of conspiracy theories, the whole breakdown of trust has such an impact on society and on culture, and therefore on our ability to work together. So should there be in the new SDGs a target for trust?
I think that this nicely brings us on to governance. So governance is how we get things done, and really whether global governments can deliver on the SDGs or whatever is to follow. Maybe I could bring Carl in on governance.
Well, so you go to a digital security summit right now, anywhere in the Western world, and you'll hear a concept being talked about all the time called strategic decoupling, which is the idea that the world is really breaking into two. There's going to be a sphere which is going to be managed by the United States, which we will be part of, another by China, and the supply chains, be that rare earth metals or electrical components or silicon chips and lots of other things, will not be considered safe in any way if they have to be sourced from the sphere which that country doesn't dominate or participate in. So really, I mean, underlying all of this, both domestically and internationally, we're living through just one of a moment of really profound political polarization, and it feels like a lot of kind of common social fabrics are being rent apart. The far right's resurgent in European publics around the world, as Ian said, that's trust in politicians, trust in journalists, trust in institutions, trust in processes, trust in the good faith of people that might sit on the other side of the aisle to you. These have all been very much attacked. And one of the reasons for that, there's lots, and if this was the kind of the normal technology kind of event that I go to, then I might dive a bit deeper in. I can maybe later on if you want me to. But there's one underlying problem with a lot of this, including climate actually, which is an area I actively work on and try and protect every COP summit when it comes up, and that's information warfare. So there's an idea which is increasingly being exploited, which is that information is not like a tool of war, it's a theatre of war. So it joins air, sea, land and space as like a weird kind of area that war happens within, and that armies and states and political campaigners and electioneers and lots of other people and extremist political mobilisations all manoeuvre in, and there's only one point in all of that, which is basically to try and create behavioural and attitudinal effects in publics. So it purely instrumentalises information, truth, facts, authority, all of that doesn't really matter. What matters is the effect that you can create by manoeuvring in information. Now, this is an area, me and my team, we work on every day trying to detect these things, trying to pull them apart, trying to understand who's doing them and what they might be doing. And then you kind of try and connect all of that and actually with the effects you can see with big multilateral processes, and you can't help but be very worried, because it's kind of like time and time again, these kinds of campaigns and the people behind them are using this kind of idea to try and drag all the most important actors in the world further and further apart from each other.
Thank
so
you.
Governance.
Yeah.
Governance is needed to knit all this stuff back together.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to follow up on. Yeah, Molly.
I'm a bit more, I was going to say enthusiastic, but maybe I'll say a bit more positive about the possibilities for regulating tech. And that's because when I was an MEP, I saw the work that was done, and I think it was effective. It's quite slow. And it's very complex, but I worked with Julia Rader, or rather she did the work. She was brilliant, because I don't understand it, but she could understand it and explain it and think of the ways to contain some of the worst excesses of the tech sector. And you may have heard Margareta Vestager this morning on the Today programme, and she is responsible in the EU for containing these risks and thinking of a way of how to regulate them without restricting the sort of innovation that's so useful to us as a human community, and making sure that the value of that innovation is shared by all of us, rather than just making a tiny number of billionaires even richer, which is the economic model that we've got at the moment. She was my political pin-up when I was an MEP. She's really intelligent and well-motivated and brilliant, and I know it's going to take her a while, but I think they're making good progress there, so I'm not that pessimistic about it. And also because my view is that the tech giants are sort of bigging up their own power. There's a sort of adolescent feeling about what goes on there. It's quite new, and we could destroy the whole human race. I'm not so convinced about that. I think there are a lot of risks there, and we have to be sensible about them and confront them, but we can find ways to regulate through law. But we do need international cooperation because, as in many sectors now, it's moved beyond the nation state, and that's where the UN needs to be more powerful and where the UN is really important. But I also wanted to talk about the power of corporations and how that transcends nation-state governments, because can we achieve the SDGs? Well, we can't while the corporations continue to operate this sort of international division of labour and sell stuff to us that they've made using exploited labour in other countries, and those global supply chains are not monitored or controlled in any way. Now, the UN is on to this, and they have been developing what's called a binding treaty on human rights and corporations. And what that means is anything you buy will have to have a supply chain monitored right down to the place where those resources came out of the ground. The EU has some law monitoring that for conflict minerals to make sure that when you buy a piece of kit, the metals in it haven't been used to fuel civil war in the Congo or somewhere like that. But the binding treaty will go further than that. And it's an active process now. I mean, in terms of information, one of the interesting things is how many of you know about that. You know, I didn't know about it until I was MEP. I went to the Human Rights Committee in Geneva and found out what was going on. And it's very impressive. Why isn't it happening? Why isn't it becoming active law? The answer is that the countries where the corporations are based, really nice countries where we have very good human rights records. Well, I would have said that about the UK until recently anyway. But, you know, countries like the US, UK, France, Canada, these are the countries that are blocking progress. So, as an example, I mean, I had people coming to me from Brazil where there'd been a Canadian mining company that had not looked after its waste from its mining products properly. They just stored them in a tailings dam, which was very badly maintained. It broke. Hundreds of people died. I went and said, we need this binding treaty to make sure that corporations can't do that. If they do that, they can be put in a court of law. But, you know, really nice Canadian government, lovely Justin Trudeau, didn't do anything. He's blocking this treaty from becoming law. 3 years later, more families came to me, exactly the same thing had happened again. So it's not just about inequality, it's about corporations that people living in this country take their pension income from that are actually causing death in other countries in the world. And so to me, that fundamental control over corporations, tech corporations, yeah, but also other mining corporations, corporations that operate those global supply chains. And I just wanted to say there is a process working towards that. And, you know, I mean, this government won't get behind it. Jeremy Corbyn was behind it. Who knows about our next government? But, you know, I suppose I'm saying politics matters globally. I'm positive about governance, but only if people like us understand what's going on and get behind the really good initiatives that are there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that because I agree. I'm a more friendly towards governance solutions, but I would see them as being in. There are almost two types. You've got your formal regulatory mechanisms, international law, but then you also have a large number of voluntary platforms to try and facilitate good collective action. And the two have quite different, often very different impacts. There's just a practical example. There's the negotiation ongoing right now in Geneva around a pandemic convention, a pandemic treaty. And the aim is that countries, the 194 member states of the World Health Organization, will agree on a treaty to prepare for and respond to pandemics, and they'll do so by May next year. That's quite ambitious, given that most treaties and most conventions and agreements take much longer to negotiate, but everybody's hopeful. However, already the key areas of contention have come out extremely clearly, and it's very similar to the ones that you've just mentioned, Molly. So 3 of them from really very solidly coming out clearly in the negotiations in Geneva. Number 1, sovereignty. So many countries unwilling to give up their sovereignty to any body or any organization that appears to have the authority over them in terms of their own national laws. Secondly, the issue of equity. And exactly as you've just been saying, there is a very clear division between the global north and the global south about what equity really means and how you achieve it. And very clearly from several countries in the global north are absolutely blocking any mention of anything that would in any way undermine the current trade architecture in the world. And then the third area is the one of accountability. And I think that's often been missing from many of these governance mechanisms, is that they don't include robust monitoring mechanisms, independent monitoring mechanisms, to ensure that compliance is taking place, that commitments are being met, and that the results are truly what people were looking for, are being achieved. So those are the three areas. I would just, though, say something very briefly about these voluntary mechanisms that are also being set up frequently, because many people realise that international law alone is not going to be sufficient and takes a long time to negotiate. The problem with the voluntary mechanisms is that they always depend on the existing systems, trade, etc. We saw that so clearly in the COVID pandemic with the access to vaccines, and that even the platforms that were set up to try and enable equitable access to vaccines did a great job, but failed miserably, if it's possible to say both things in one sentence. They managed to get a lot of vaccine out, but getting it out in a way that actually meant that those who most needed it got it out when they most needed it never happened. So I think we've got to look both in terms of the regulatory side, but we also have to look at how we monitor these platforms and how we've enabled them to work more effectively to deliver the results that we're looking for.
Can I add something real quick?
Yes, please do.
Hi. Yeah, so I think this is another example where I could argue the importance of engaging the creative industries in these policies, because, as we all know, some of these, like I was at UNEP, the UNEP meeting last year, where they made a lot of work, or they made a lot of progress against plastic pollution and mercury. And they're really standing up to sort of the corporate world, but not a lot of people knew that this was happening, because unless you go to the UN website and you read their 500-page report, you're not necessarily always going to know about some of this really important work being done. But if you can engage creatives, who I can argue are great translators, being able to, if they understand the UN NGO and policy world, take these 500-page reports and translate it into some sort of content that could resonate with a wider audience, I think more people would know about these historic movements in this space. And especially with socially conscious artists who are justice-based creatives, you could have a huge group of allies if it was more mainstream for policymakers and program experts to engage with the creative community in a very equally in a partnership level. And I just think that we are underutilized in this space, and I would like to see that change.
Okay, and I would like to take it from another angle that Molly mentioned. In asking that question, can global governance achieve the goals, the SDG goals? I think I'll take the two pillars again. We have to think about the global north and the global south. And most of the time, the global south is dependent on funding from the global north. So much as there may be structures in the global south, which, if used, can help achieve those goals, the economic model, which, like Molly mentioned, overrides the societal model. So the economic model dictates what should be done on the ground in the global south. And that really makes it difficult to accomplish the goals. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, the impact that the global governance is having. Mm-hmm. If there can be equity, if those agreements can be treated on a level platform, I think global governance will help achieve the goals down there.
Great, perfect. So one thing that kind of has come up for me is really the highly complex and interconnected world that we live in, and whether that's in the political sphere or more in the commercial sphere. And does this complexity and interconnectedness reduce our resilience, or does it actually give more power that we can leverage in terms of delivering these sustainable development goals? Who would like to kick off on that?
Can you repeat the question?
So we live in a highly complex and interconnected world, and is this reducing our resilience given particularly climate change, or actually does this give us more leverage because of that interconnectedness and complexity in order of furthering the SDGs?
Okay, I think it gives us more leverage. Mm-hmm. Why am I saying that? We can look at what I call the 4 C's: consultation, cooperation, collaboration, and coordination. Now, if we really go in a level-minded way and consult, so I don't do for you, you don't do for me, we consult each other, that's the discussion stage. Then we cooperate, we agree on achieving a common goal. Then we collaborate to produce something. And we know that things are not that simple, they are complicated. So we need coordination. And if we put these together, I think we can leverage on each other to rather solve problems. So I think it gives us a leverage to address the goals. The issue is, how do we go about it? Mm-hmm. That is what makes the difference. Mm-hmm. And if we can really go about it in an objective manner and take the three communities into use, who are the stakeholders? What are the roles of each stakeholder? Who will actually carry on this after the project phase? Right? Where is the money coming from and how can we sustain it? I think it's rather a leveraging platform that can help us solve complex problems.
Okay. Carl?
I come at the question of interconnectedness, of course, from a particular angle, which is the interconnectedness of especially the internet and all the things that we use to be able to reach across the world and influence each other. And I have to say, like, I think it is something of perhaps one of the most profound ironies of our age, that in a world so awash with data and information, it actually feels like the world's becoming more and more mysterious. To me, and I think to many people, it's increasingly hard to know how our lives are being shaped. It's hard to know who's doing the shaping. It's hard to, I mean, framing this in terms of power, it's power is taking all these weird configurations, be they in the hands of billionaires or cyber criminals or hackers or weird online subcultures that increasingly seem to kind of be able to like mobilize and kind of bleed out of online spaces and change markets and dethrone corporations or remake societies in new ways. Underlying all of that, and this is the conclusion of a book which I wrote several years ago, which I'm saving you having to read by giving you the kind of like the conclusion, right? we basically is that power's gone weird and wild, and it's become quite unchained and quite unrecognised actually by lots of institutions and political authorities around the world. And in that weird and unchained form, it is mysterious to us. So like this kind of dualism really of how being connected in ways which we often don't realise is happening allows people to shape our lives in ways which we don't really realise is happening, creates a world which is more mysterious, I think is actually, alongside all the amazing new kind of coordination opportunities that it brings, also brings this kind of big new threat and danger about mystery and about overlooking the centres of power that really exists. Mm-hmm. You go to Las Vegas at the right time every year and you'll see DEF CON happen. You know, all the gamblers kind of get replaced by all people with like shock blue mohawks and blockchain tattoos and things like that. And they'll show you incidents and examples of power which you wouldn't imagine. You know, that they'll prove on stages, huge glowing neon stages, that they can cause wind turbines to lock and explode, or that they'll be able to hack laptops using light, you know, or that they'll have trained in AI to find vulnerabilities in websites. Just example after example of power which is just not well understood, I think, by most of us right now.
Can I chip in? I agree with you to the extent that we're living in a very disrupted age, and that's largely because the internet is new. I mean, it's one of the few advantages in getting old that you can remember before things were there. I mean, for me, the internet started in about 1992. I can remember going to reference libraries. You know, it's unbelievable now when all that's available right there. That has been a huge benefit for mankind without any question. I mean, I can know what's happening in Ghana now through the internet, right? I don't have to spend however much time getting there. So we are now finally the global village that people talked about for so long, and that's an absolutely amazing step forward in terms of achieving global equity. But it's been very disruptive in terms of power, because some people have found ways to use it as a new technology, and we haven't yet found ways to contain that. I confidently believe that we will. If you look back to you know, when the book came along, that was hugely disruptive, and we went into the Reformation and religious wars. I'm afraid to say millions of people died as a consequence of that. It was extremely disruptive. But eventually we moved beyond that. People learned to read. Power systems reasserted themselves, and actually we moved into a democratic era. So good. Cinema came along. People were similarly disruptive in terms of what they understood about truth, where knowledge came from. There was a huge amount of propaganda. You know, we saw the rise of fascism. A lot of that was fueled by moving images, which the Nazis, for example, used very effectively. Politics very disrupted. Oh God, I'm going to say again, millions of people died, which they did. But, you know, at the end of the Second World War, we set up institutions, global institutions for the first time, democratic institutions. So I suppose my message there is let's get to that phase before millions of people die, in a way, which I'm trying to be optimistic, but, you know, we are living in a disrupted age. I agree with you. I don't feel pessimistic about our ability to regulate that so long as we take it sufficiently seriously. I didn't really mean to say that. What I meant to say was when these are questions about power, I agree, and when you're asking questions about power, generally I find following the money is very useful. So a lot of the disruption that's going on online is funded by people like, they call them the Koch brothers, don't they, in the US? Koch, we would say, in Europe. You know, they're deliberately funding this kind of information, disinformation. Similarly, if you look at what's happening at the COP process, you know, we've got fossil fuel lobbyists, more fossil fuel lobbyists than people coming from countries. We just need to change that rule. No fossil fuel lobbyists in the room. You know, so it's power by rich people who control economic interests, stopping those things happening. And again, it's a question of knowing what's happening and then knowing the change you have to make. I don't find it difficult to know the change you have to make. I find it difficult to persuade people to give me enough political power to make that change, to be honest with you. But generally, as a green economist, I would say both these things. Having a global system where we understand each other is hugely empowering in terms of solving these problems. But what's not particularly useful is relying on global supply chains in a world that's becoming increasingly disrupted, whether that's about COVID or extreme weather events. I mean, I live in Stroud. It's very hilly. It's there because the mills could use the mill streams rushing down the valleys to drive the mill wheels, and consequently, when there's a flash flood, it all rushes down and we flood every time, which we did this past week again. So I suppose we've got a sense of the need for local resilience, and so I'm part of a community farm. It's a mile away. I can walk there and get my vegetables. I just pay the farmer amount to grow those vegetables. We get the land for free. Obviously, during COVID, nothing changed. After Ukraine, nothing changed. Price is just the same. When we had a really bad flood a few years ago, nothing changed. Just walk to the farm, get my vegetables. So to me, that's a good example of local resilience, which is really important in terms of food. I would say also energy. As many systems as we can, we should make resilient like that at a local level. But I'm sort of saying both and, because the global interconnections are also really important and valuable in solving the larger scale problems that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess one thing that I find quite interesting, Ben's point about that coordination and the power in that we can leverage, but also where the power's gone weird, is around the burning platform for change. So in COVID, we had a burning platform for change. People were dying, the cause and effect, the time between the cause and the impact was really short. And so, you know, to a certain extent, global powers came together to try and solve that. What we have with the climate crisis is actually the cause is now, but the effect is much later. So the burning platform is there, but we're not feeling it. And I guess what can we have learned from the pandemic, from that crisis, to create that burning platform for change and look at using these sort of highly complex interconnected networks to coordinate and leverage good rather than just reduce our resilience.
The most important lesson is we should have gone for fossil fuels earlier. That's what's causing the climate crisis, because they sent out a lot of very effective propaganda, and because they're run by extremely rich and powerful people, we didn't start that early enough, but we are doing that now. I mean, I talk there as Green Party, as Extinction Rebellion, as well as a green economist. I mean, it surprises me. I can remember the first time I thought we're going to be living in a world without fossil fuels, and it was after I was elected as an MEP, so like less than 10 years ago, and that really surprises me. But that's by far the most important thing that we have to do, and that's why I'm very concerned that the next COP is being run, you know, is in an oil state and being run by their oil minister? I don't want to create, you know, legal problems for you, but yeah, so, you know, the oil people are right at the heart of that COP process. And unfortunately, in this country, we've also got a government that's giving permission for more oil and gas exploration. So I don't worry about any of the other stuff. I just think it's starve fossil fuels of finance, move away from fossil fuels yourself as fast as you can.
I think another thing is we have to move away from managing disasters to managing risks, because the disaster is a realization of the risk. But the moment we start managing the risks, then we are using information available to us to prevent the disaster. So when we make that shift, I think it's also going to bring a lot of change in the way, the impact.
And that reminds me of your opening comments, Ian, about that cycle of panic. So I don't know if there's any comment around that. What can we learn?
The burning platform, certainly of COVID, was very obvious. The remarkable thing is how ineffective the global response was, even when you're faced with a catastrophe of that nature, because, again, the one for a better term, the politics of the world at this time even managed to get in the way of taking effective collective action against a threat that isn't coming from any one country or any one group, that's coming from a virus. And yet still, we didn't manage to get our act together as a world, even despite all that was going on at the time. The incredible economic impacts, even then, the geopolitics prevented the G7, the G20, and others from actually taking the steps that would have really made a difference. And others, you know, the UN itself, it was the Security Council and the General Assembly, paralysed, not quite, but their ability to really take the action that was needed was severely compromised by the internal divisions within and between countries. So I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think we've seen over the years that the world's ability to work together is really not very good. Not
let
very
me just
strong.
come in. I'm turning into the Pollyanna here, which doesn't usually happen. So, but let me just say, while I don't disagree with that, I think what happened at the level of individuals and communities was quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't know about you, but my street immediately set up a WhatsApp group. We knew who the vulnerable people were in our street, people going around and visiting them. You know, as a human community, we were amazing right across the world. And I think there's something to learn there about, you know, having more confidence in ourselves and not always feeling that we have to rely on systems. And that's what local resilience is about. It's about that community response. You know, the reason we had a lockdown in this country, which the government was resisting, was because people were staying at home, because they recognised they needed to do that to protect themselves and to protect their community and vulnerable people. So I think as humans, we were amazing. We worked out what was going on really quickly. We worked out what we had to do, stay away from each other and look after vulnerable people. And we just put that into practice, street by street, community by community. I mean, that's what we can do. So, yeah, it's a shame that the global institutions aren't quite keeping up with us.
I wouldn't say it's the institutions, it's the way that the world works globally.
Yeah.
It's the multilateral system. I don't mean international organisations. It's the way that collectively we work transnationally. I totally agree with you in terms of the communities, absolutely.
And I was going to say, it brings us back to society, which is the point you were making.
Exactly. And also the dimension of managing risks instead of disasters, because if let me put it, I'm a meteorologist, so let me speak in the meteorology space. We can have emergency management, we can have operational management, and we can have strategic management, policy-wise, right? The kind of information you need for policy is completely different from the kind of information you need for emergency management. And it's also different from the kind of information you need for operational management. So if we shift the focus and say it's about resilience, that means we are now talking about all time scales. We are putting the weight is not just on response. The weight is on operational issues. How does the policy we are talking about, we are making for the future, how will it be implemented? So we are also thinking of the structure to implement that policy. I'm talking like a meteorologist. If you look at climate change, for example, I think everybody knows about climate change. If you do anything and you don't put climate change in it, nobody reacts. It's like what you are doing is not that important. And I have a challenge with that, because climate change is just one aspect of the whole spectrum. If you want to talk about resilience, You see, the IPCC is projecting that there will be an increase in the intensity and frequency of these extreme events. The question is, when those extreme events occur, what will they be? That's no longer climate change. They will occur as weather events. So if we are not building the weather infrastructure now, and we are being told that the weather we are predicting now is going to get worse, that's what the IPCC information is telling us. You are talking about weather prediction now. They are telling you that the kind of things you are predicting right now is going to increase in intensity, is going to increase in frequency. That means you need to improve the infrastructure now. But then everybody is focusing on the policy aspect and not putting a lot of weight on the short-term prediction, which is what will be needed to address the policy. And if you come the middle way, which is operational, people are coping all the time. If you tell a farmer that the rainfall this season is going to be bad, that's not climate change. That's not climate, that's climate variability. Because next year the rainfall can be good, right? But the farmer will make a decision based on the information you're giving him now. He's not using the climate change information. And once we begin to address all these pieces, it delves into the climate change issues and definitely will build the resilience. So Molly was talking about local resilience. And for me, it's about all the levels. Resilience at all the levels. Resilience locally, resilience regionally, resilience globally. And I think if we start thinking that way, I think that's more or less for me, if I'm to make a TikTok in this thing, I would say that comes after the SDGs.
Brilliant, great. And I think that sort of speaks to rather than sustainability, adaptability and how we adapt. Now, I'm conscious I haven't given the audience an opportunity to ask a question yet, which might be very frustrating for them. Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to do that awful thing where I try and knit together all the different topics, if that's okay. So some key words for me. So I'm thinking ahead to what comes after the SDGs, so after 2030. And I'm listening to what you're saying, so I'm thinking about some of the key topics that you mentioned. So I'm imagining a post-SDG framework that is about preparedness, that is driven by culture, of all different definitions of culture, that is based on a green economy, that involves communities, and is kind of driven by ethical innovation. So my question is kind of simple one: how do you get there? Do you see? I mean, what do we need to do to get to that kind of really idealistic, utopia, and fantastic vision of a world after 2030? What do we need to do differently?
Okay. So the question is, what do we need to do differently to get to that state of preparedness, that utopia? Who would like to pick that up?
I'm going to refer you to a book that I wrote.
Okay. Right, let's start with Lisa, who was...
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
Yes, so I was involved with the, if any of you knew about the My World survey, which took place 3 years before 2015, where they were collecting information from various stakeholders about the world that you want to see. And that helps determine sort of the basis for the baseline for what the SDGs were to become. Unfortunately, again, these are like political and programmatic processes that don't reach all, segments or sectors of society. So you end up with a list of like priorities that are dictated by people who would have access to that survey. And they did spend 3 years, really trying to go out and talk to civil society and collect the data and all of that, that then was brought into town hall discussions with civil society to help draft the language of the SDG outcome document. I think if we want a more inclusive document for the next 15 years, and we saw a big shift in terms of the Millennial Development Goals into the Sustainable Development Goals into sort of what's coming next, then I think the process needs to be more, more accessible and more intentionally inclusive than it has been in the past in order for us to really gauge what are the priorities. I hope that we're going to see a lot of systems change. I hope we, do have involvement of creatives, because creatives are not just entertainers, we're creative thinkers and problem solvers. And I would, hope that they also make an effort to reach those that, may not be able to access a data survey on, their cell phone because of the digital divide or whatever, and just make it a much more inclusive process. if they do what they did last time, which is to start the process 3 years early, that means that we're going to be starting the process in 4 years? We have 7 years till the 2015, is that right? Sorry, I'm trying to do the math. But I would also say that, those of us who are involved in the SDGs right now need to let our voices heard that we want a more inclusive system. It may not, I think, go well with some of the current systems at the UN, but I think that change needs to be discussed.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Carl.
It's a wonderful question. I have two sub-answers. One is an answer which is quite easy, but it's kind of harder to see how you get there, and the other one is an answer which is harder, but in a sense easier to get there. So around ethical innovation, it's kind of quite easy to see what we do really, which is to kind of drag kind of technology development and the people that do it under democratic control. It's happening. As Molly said, it is happening. Like the European Union for its sins is kind of taking on global responsibility to regulate technology. And around that, we will see over the next 2 or 3 years kind of institutional building around all of this. There'll be some Royal College of Algorithmists, I'm sure, forming sooner or later. There is an absolutely frenzied amount of work currently happening around AI, especially certainly given the not zero likelihood prospect of there being a general artificial intelligence which might pose an existential risk to humanity that has actually got politicians' attention. So there's lots happening there. And so we'll see a kind of web of squishy human law-making, ethic-making, norm-setting kind of work that will build the bars back on that cage of that weird power, I think. Yeah, I probably lean towards being more optimistic than pessimistic there. The question, of course, is whether that can build new bars as power continues to change and get even weirder, and whether we can keep that process of renewal fast enough. The one which is more difficult, and we haven't spoken about this too much yet, but I think it really does reflect how governments and political leaders can't deal with a very large number of issues in parallel to each other. There's only a certain amount of attention the civil service can have, certain amount of political capital they can have. We haven't spoken about Ukraine very much. But like the invasion of Ukraine, it is impossible to overstate how much that has reformed our conception of our security order and what being safe looks like. I mean, no one, I never in any interaction I had in government up to 6 months before Ukraine ever discussed the prospect of a raging land war happening in Eastern Europe. And of course that's happening all the time now, and that's completely changed, I think, the British government's conception of what it needs to do, not in 10 years or 15 or 20 years time to stay safe, but actually what it's, on next month and the month after that, and where money is going to, and what parts of the civil service are getting most traction and most visibility. I think for the right reasons, really, sadly, it's that it's quite hard for governments to think very long term when there's the prospect of very, very nasty short-term implications happening. Not to mention, of course, all the ecological damage that Ukraine has caused, and not to mention, for these people in power, they have to deal with kind of contingencies and exigencies that we actually, it's kind of really frightening to imagine from the outside. So there are people in there right now, I'm sure, thinking about nuclear decision making. There are people in there right now thinking about what happens if Zaporizhia runs out of water. What happens if there are more dam strikes? What happens if Ukraine breaks through and gets to Crimea? There are so many kind of questions like that the government's having to deal with. So that's hard to see how to navigate through that, and how we can really build kind of longer term planning around kind of probably more equally as existential crisis in the long term, of course, around the climate crisis, in a way which can kind of balance between that. But it just has felt like, and I come from a think tank, and so it just felt like for years now we've just lurched from this one consuming crisis into the next, and we've just not had a time to take our breath and to breathe and do long term policy planning or long term policy work. It just felt like these events just keep hitting us in ways which is hard to deal with.
Thank you. I can carry on from there. Because Ukraine obviously is a horrifying tragedy in itself, but it's also not an accident because it's part of the shift away from democratic values and norms in our human community, because Putin launched the war to reinforce his position at home as an authoritarian. And so I wanted to mention, the importance of keeping to those democratic values which have kept the peace since 1945. And obviously some countries have had better times than others because of the power they had in 1945. But I think it's important to see Ukraine as part of a pattern of failed diplomacy on our side, as well as authoritarian manoeuvring on Putin's side. But in terms of your question, I wanted to say that, firstly, I need to be clear that 2030 is too late. If we haven't reached net zero by 2030, the future climate catastrophe we're setting up is going to be really awful for our children and grandchildren. And so I think what you mentioned about norms is really important. I've talked a lot about laws. I'm keen on laws. I think they can do a lot of good, but norms are also really important. We are all engaged in behaviour on a daily basis that means millions of people across the world are dying right now because of climate consequences, and many more will die in the future. And yet it's absolutely fine in our society to do those things. So obviously, you won't be surprised to hear I've been outside the standard norms for quite a long time. I gave up flying a long time ago. I don't have a car. I had a heat pump put in. Actually, it was turned on the day Putin went into Ukraine, so I put a little sticker on it that says, "This machine destroys fascists." I feel very pleased with myself. But I don't feel anybody's followed my lead. I've got to say, I feel I've been alone. It's really hard where I live, travelling by bus and bike, but I think we can all do our bit to change those norms, and getting a heat pump is very straightforward. It costs you a bit up front, which is obviously gross injustice because it's cheaper once you get it up and running. But I found that hard to do. There was no support or encouragement or really decent information. I just had to go out there and do it. But it's great. I really recommend it. I was only half joking about the book because I did write a book called The Bioregional Economy, and I attempted to answer really more or less the questions that you're asking there. And I did bring in quite a lot of discussion about power and governance and which level it was appropriate to answer the various questions at. And a lot of it was about bringing power much lower to the local level, and also introducing different systems of governance, including citizens, juries, and genuine engagement with people, because I think there's a lot of wisdom in the community which not only is it a waste of creative energy when politicians don't use it, but it's also partly why people are alienated from their political systems. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, I started out saying I think living within planetary limits and designing an economy that does that should be rule number one. It's about climate, it's about biodiversity, and once you make that point, you then immediately move on to how to share those resources fairly. And if you do that sum, the answer is we have to consume a lot less. But to me, that's not a devastating realisation. One of the chapters in my book was called What About My iPod? And it was sort of symbolic to me that by the time I published it, I had to change that to iPad because nobody was using iPods anymore. That was because my daughter asked me that question, and she said, "Oh no, Mum, you're never going to sell that to anybody. It sounds really awful." The sort of local, comfortable community life I was selling. But I must say, by the time she got to the age of 21, she said, "Oh, actually, maybe you got a point there, Mum." So really what I was saying is let's not focus so much on plastic crap that's, hugely energy and resource intensive and actually doesn't make us very happy. And you may notice with Apple, you always have to buy another one the following year and then work out how that works and then throw that one away. That model is very destructive in terms of the environment, but also I think I found it quite exhausting just keeping up with everything. Plus, I'm not sure it's really very fulfilling on a human level compared to culture, community, learning to play the fiddle and joining a Ceilidh band. I think it would make you more satisfied than playing with your iPad. Anyway, I leave it to you to try.
Ben?
I think that question, I want to take that question from another perspective. It's a very challenging question as far as I'm concerned, because it's like asking, how do we get our research results mainstreamed? You know the factors, you know the points. How do you get them to work? And I think, again, going to Molly's, the economic model is important, because I like to think globally but act locally. But the question is, there are internal factors and there are external factors. The external factors influence the internal factors, but it doesn't stop us from doing anything internally, locally. So for me, if we can address how to take the research results and make them operational, then you can get a model to try and address the question you are asking. Because right now, the donors or the people with the economic power are more project focused. They want you to demonstrate things over a 3-year span, over a 2-year span, and then it ends there, the money cuts, and you can't do anything after that. Real development, like I said from the beginning, starts after you've demonstrated the issues, the value of the issues. But that's when you don't have any funding. So it stops there, and you can publish the results, and it stays on the shelf, and that's it, right? So until we are able to mainstream our research results, a suitable economic model which can help us to mainstream the research results, I think addressing that question is very difficult.
Yes.
Just to say thank you to everyone who's organised this, it's really, really brilliant. Just a quick question, kind of leading on for Stuart's really is, think about what could happen beyond 2030. What would a decolonised, alternative or progression to the SDGs look like? And I'd just be really interested to hear from all your different perspectives what you think that could mean for that work.
Great. So what would the decolonised progression of the SDGs look like? Who would like to tackle that one?
Okay, so I think decolonization is psychological, it's cultural, and to some extent economical as well, right? So having people to be confident, having people to be free in their mind that I can do this. I'm talking from the global south perspective. I can do this, right? And despite whatever external factors are there, I have a role. I have a role to, because honestly speaking, we blame most of these high-level global issues. Global politicians are not doing that. The UN is not doing that. The UN, but there are so many things we can do on the ground, which is independent of those things. And for me, acting on those ones, having the confidence to say, I live in this environment. This is affecting me. I don't have funding from anywhere. What can I do about it? That freedom, that psychological mindset, I think is everything, right? And if we can do that, sometimes we can even convince philanthropists. You can even be local philanthropists to give you money to implement some of these things. So decolonizing it is getting people to be free culturally, psychologically, mentally, and that will liberate them to take action, even if it's locally.
This is really important, and I totally agree with what you're saying, but obviously my focus is the economic structures and the structure of the global trade system and how that's actually allowed colonialism to continue even after countries gained their political independence. Because you remember previously I talked about 1945 and the settlement then, which was from an economic point of view made at Bretton Woods in 1944, IMF, GATT as it was there for trade, now the WTO and the World Bank. Now if you look at the photograph of who was in the room there, I think I'm right in saying they were all white, they were all men. I think they were all white. Some Latin American countries were there, but most of the countries of the world today didn't exist in 1945 and they were simply not represented. So it's not surprising that the structures that they set up worked in favour of those white Western countries because those are the people who were in the room. Japan obviously wasn't there either because they were defeated in World War II. They were like the enemy in 1944. So clearly we've got the wrong structures because we've got structures that don't represent most of the world now. And I mean, people have argued for a long time we need to revisit those structures, but I think that's becoming more and more pressing because whatever you have at UN level, if the economic structures are run in this grossly undemocratic way, then you're not going to resolve the issues. Now, we have a big responsibility as the UK because we were, we had the largest empire, we had the most powerful empire. During that time, We extracted resources from the countries that were our colonies, and we used a huge amount of coal, and we were the largest historic emitter of carbon dioxide emissions until relatively recently, because we were the first through the Industrial Revolution. So that gives us a huge responsibility as former colonisers and former industrial society to repair the damage that we've done across the rest of the world, which we're not doing. We're supporting the institutions that continue this exploitation. So I think Britain has an absolutely primary responsibility here, and this is what we call climate reparations, acknowledging our debt to those countries and providing finance to repair that debt, and also technology and expertise, which we could share. I mean, the encouraging thing is that there are now some examples of projects where money is given or even the equipment is given to set up renewable energy generation in countries that don't have enough electricity. This has been done in South Africa and in Indonesia. Conversely, we have agreements which effectively allow us to offshore the absorption of our carbon dioxide emissions by appropriating the land in the global south, including land that people need for agricultural forestry. So, instead of changing our lifestyle, reducing our CO2 emissions, we're just going to plant trees in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever. And that is, we're setting up a sort of second version of colonialism there, in my view, unless we address that. And that was what happened in Glasgow. This is where I become extremely pessimistic and really quite furious, because, having exploited people in round one of colonialism, we're now posturing on the world stage that we're global leaders. But what we're actually doing is using our wealth that we create from thin air to buy their land, so they can't have control of their own land. So that matters. But I think when we talk about colonialism, we're talking in terms of countries. One of the things that's sort of disrupted is that we're moving beyond countries now. What we see is a sort of what was it Theresa May referred to as citizens of nowhere. Those, to me, are the global oligarchs. Where do they really belong? They can buy any passport they want. It's not about being a citizen of a country. And I think that's enabled their power to sort of slip out from any of these global institutions anyway, because they just have so much wealth and power that they can exercise on their own. So I think that's something we really need to contain, both through changing the nationality law so people can't just buy any old passport, but also constraining their wealth through wealth taxes and making sure that they do have to take responsibility like the rest of us. This is very important in terms of the climate crisis, because they live in a fantasy world where they can just go and live on some sort of off-world colony when the going gets tough. Obviously that's nonsense. We're not going to be able to live on Mars, but while they've got enough money and can maintain that fantasy, they don't feel they're part of the same world, and they don't feel they need to address these very real crises we're facing.
Can I say something?
Yes, please, Lisa.
Yeah, so I might sound like a broken record, but as we know, the creative economy is like one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and you don't need a certain educational, degree to enter and become a creative. You don't need a certain ethnicity, you don't need a certain income level. And so the rise in the creative economy, I think, is creating a space where there is, more equality and more inclusivity. And I feel that if we created more spaces, we would see a more diverse landscape in the SDG movement. If you go to festivals, if you go to studios, if you go to spaces where there are a lot of creatives that are congregated, there is a lot of diversity, a lot of inclusivity. And I think that we are missing out by not incorporating more of the creatives in this movement. We mentioned two big issues, big picture issues, climate change and COVID. And if you think about, or a lot of people that I've asked, when did you first start thinking about climate change? It was because of the movie An Inconvenient Truth. When we think about what helped you get through the pandemic, it was the arts, music, books, movies, whatever. And still, yet there's still not enough representation of creatives in the SDG space. So yeah, I would just say decolonizing the SDG movement, global health, all of that, it would be beneficial to incorporate especially the informal arts sector in that discussion and in that community.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Yes,
I'm just going
please
to
do.
one more quick point in terms of what needs to be taken up as part of addressing this decolonisation agenda. And it's not, of course, economics is critical, politics is critical, but I would also say information. Access to information, the way that research and innovation is carried out and the results of that research and innovation are made available, who gets access to it, that's another area that's going to need real attention.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I think I'd quite like to, just before we wrap up, just touch on sort of ethics and global values, and arguably the SDGs is promoting a certain set of global values, and if we get to the point where we can live within the carbon budget, the environmental budget that the planet has, we are going to have lots of ethical dilemmas in order to work through, which Molly mentioned many of those. So, what should we be doing to prepare our communities for these complex ethical dilemmas? Yeah, Carl.
I'm going to be optimistic. Yes. Saving it to the end. Digital democracy. This is an area I'm absolutely fascinated with, and I think it has real potential to transform our ability to find consensus across people and groups that are in completely different parts of the world, live completely different lives. There's not enough time for me to really go into how it works, but suffice it to say, there are people feverishly working actually on innovation which tries to structure conversations to allow consensuses to emerge. If you go to Taiwan, there they have a process called V-Taiwan, where it's a digital democratic process where they've kind of flipped the kind of basic way in which social media platforms on its head to mean that rather than the things becoming most visible being the things that kind of glue you to the platform, which tend to be actually the things that make you angriest or most outraged, it's actually the opposite. It's items or statements or claims or proposals which, through a clever way of understanding maths and information, this process is understood to be gaining consensus and support from very different tribes and very different groups. It's extremely exciting. We're seeing a kind of bubbling innovation like that, using that kind of consensus finding, bridge building kind of mechanisms on a local governmental stage now in the UK. As well, I think very much inspired and driven by Taiwan's example, and that is, I think we're absolutely right now to start using these kinds of new consensus-seeking, bridge-seeking kind of conversations to try and find often buried but yet existing items of consensus on a global stage, or at least to try, because we really need to build kind of ways of finding what we have in common with each other rather than ways of finding where we disagree. And far too often the discursive mechanisms we have do the latter rather than the former, but they needn't.
So I'm going to be pessimistic in a minute. No, I think deliberative democracy is really important. It's becoming increasingly difficult to, as Alistair Campbell has it, disagree agreeably. That's what democracy is all about. If we all agreed with each other, we wouldn't need democracy, right? We'd just have technocrats implementing everything. But we seem to have, and this is something social media has done, I think, it's kind of removed that grey space where you say, oh, I'm not really sure about that, tell me more. That's what it's all about. And I think anything that encourages that space is really important in establishing what these new norms are. I'm quite sceptical about digital democracy, mainly because how that came to me. I mean, I'd like to know more about the detail of it, but that came to me through people during the kind of Brexit debate saying we just need people sitting in their bedroom voting yes or no, subject to massive amounts of disinformation online. And also people thought that the really complex financial legislation I was working on, spending all my time thinking about it, having expert advisors on, they'd also be deciding that in their bedroom, just yes, no. So, that worries me slightly, because I can tell you, as a professor of economics, that was absolutely the edge of my ability to cope. And yeah, it's much easier when somebody just gives you some very strong, powerful, motivating line that's actually not true. So yeah, bit of a worry, but anyway, let me hear more, because it sounds a lot more sophisticated than what they were talking about. The most important thing we have to do is tell the truth, and that's really difficult because there's some really grim truths out there, but I think always tell the truth in a way that gives people the opportunity to take positive action and offer solutions. Like I said, I think it's all about where power is. That's why things aren't happening. I agree with you. There's a lot of consensus about what we should do. People generally do like fairness. They like to live in happy communities. They don't want to kill weasels and bats and everything. So we're largely in agreement, but certain people are doing extremely well out of this system and out of these broken power structures. And so I suppose to me, the most important values are democratic values, widely interpreted. And I think it's important that we cling on to those because they're really under threat on a global basis. And I think we need to reinterpret what they mean because, you know, the sort of human rights, democratic values that were established in the wake of the Second World War were quite a narrow, white American way of looking at it, largely. I mean, we had some influence, and that's no longer appropriate for this global world. But at the same time, I'd quite like to hang on to a lot of those when I don't see democratic systems working in other parts of the world. So for me, that's the tension that we need to address. What are the norms and values that we can agree as a human society? When you say liberal Western values, maybe we're going to have to give up some of those, but yeah, I'm certainly clinging on to ones that are about democracy, human rights and representation. And, you know, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have felt I needed to say that, but now I really feel that we need to defend those actively.
Any other follow-up?
Yeah, I'll say, I guess I'll just close by saying, I do feel that the system for engaging creatives is extremely unethical because of the lack of representation. You should be having young people, you know, leading the youth movement. You should be having Indigenous leaders leading the Indigenous movement. You should be having women leading the women's movement. Why are creatives not leading the creative and cultural movement? I believe that when you sit at a table and you hear people use the word they instead of we, then you should be relinquishing control and power and privilege and let the communities kind of dictate their own, you know, programs and policies in order to make it more ethical.
Great. Well, sadly, we've reached the end of our time. It's been a fantastic and fascinating debate and one that I've certainly learnt a lot from. I think it's almost impossible to sum up apart from saying it's complicated.
But there is hope.
But there is hope, and certainly, you know, that the evolution of the SDGs into whatever comes next, there are some really important things to understand, that technology is part of the answer, but maybe needs more regulation, that culture needs to be mainstream through it because it's one of the best ways to engage with those marginalised voices, and that we need to think about how we mainstream and operationalise things, and we need to learn lessons from the pandemic and stop this cycle of panic and crisis management, but much more into that risk management space. And there is much we can do within our own lives and these local solutions to make us more resilient. So, and I probably missed lots of really fantastic points that were made. If I could ask you to thank our panel. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, and thank you to those who are online as well.